A low hum crackled through the static, punctuated by the dispatcher's voice. Unit 72, all clear? My fingers hovered over the microphone button. A momentary hesitation as I stared at the empty parking lot displayed on the CCTV monitors. The fluorescent lights in the tiny security office flickered overhead like a dying heartbeat. It was only my second week on the night shift at Whitestone Mall. A crumbling, half-abandoned relic that should have been demolished years ago, but someone thought it was worth guarding. I pressed the button. All clear. The lot stretched out like an ocean of asphalt, illuminated by pale orange streetlights. Not a single car, not a shadow, just endless quiet. I leaned back in the creaky office chair and sipped my bitter coffee, trying to shake off the creeping weight of drowsiness. That's when I noticed it. One of the monitors blinked off, then back on. Just for a second. I leaned in, frowning. Camera 13. The East Wing service corridor. It was dark, a little too dark. The emergency lights were always on, but the feed showed only blackness. I grabbed the flashlight from the desk and stood up, my body protesting from hours of sitting. As I opened the office door, the cool night air rushed in, heavy with the scent of mildew and something faintly metallic. It didn't help that the East Wing was the most derelict part of the mall, full of broken storefronts and peeling wallpaper. Halfway down the corridor, my boots echoed sharply against the tile floor. It was like walking into a void, my flashlight beam swallowed by the surrounding darkness. That's when I heard it. A soft scrape like nails dragging across a surface. Hello! My voice wavered slightly, betraying my nerves. The sound didn't come again. I told myself it was probably a stray cat or a raccoon. Things that had no business inside but always found a way. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Then the lights flickered, and the scrape came again. Louder, closer. I swung the flashlight wildly, the beam jittering over graffiti-covered walls and piles of debris. My pulse hammered in my ears. There was nothing there. I backed up, my breath coming shallow, until my heel hit something soft. I turned and my stomach dropped. It was a shoe. A single, muddy shoe. And not the kind you'd expect to find in a decrepit mall. This was fresh, new. I nudged it with the flashlight, and a slow, creeping dread climbed my spine as I noticed the small puddle of red pooling beside it. Blood. The scrape came again, this time from the ceiling. My flashlight shot upward. There it was. A figure, twisted and wrong, clung to the ceiling like a spider. Its limbs were impossibly long, its fingers bent at grotesque angles as they dug into the plaster. Its face was pale, stretched, and blank except for two enormous black eyes that seemed to absorb the light. Couldn't breathe. It cocked its head, the movement unnervingly fast, and its gaze locked onto mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then it dropped. I stumbled backward, the flashlight flying from my hand and spinning wildly on the floor. Its beam landed on the creature's face as it crawled toward me, its joints cracking with every unnatural movement. The smell hit me, a rancid, sickly sweet odor that turned my stomach. I scrambled to my feet, my heart in my throat, and ran. The corridor seemed endless. My legs burned, my breaths ragged, but I didn't dare look back. That sound, the scrape, was behind me, closer with every step. I burst into the main atrium, my boots skidding on the tiles as I whipped around to face the darkness. Nothing. The corridor was empty. I stumbled into the security office, locking the door behind me and grabbing the radio with shaking hands. Dispatch. There's someone here. My voice cracked as I spat the words, desperate for a response. Unit 72. Repeat? It's not human, I shouted, slamming my fist on the desk. Send someone now. The line went dead, just static. The monitors flickered. All 12 feeds lit up, showing every corner of the mall. My blood ran cold. The thing was on every screen, crawling through the corridors, scaling walls, moving faster than I thought possible. And then it stopped, turned to face one of the cameras. Its head tilted again, as if it could see me. Then the feed cut to black. A sound outside the office door made me freeze. A low, guttural growl, followed by the unmistakable scrape of nails on metal. I backed away, my eyes darting to the corner of the room where the old emergency axe hung on the wall. I grabbed it, my knuckles white as I raised it defensively. The doorknob rattled. A single word came from the other side, whispered in a voice that wasn't human. "Run." But I didn't. Not this time. The door exploded inward. Splinters flew like shrapnel as the thing tore through the thin wood, its grotesque limbs contorting as it forced its way inside. The dim office lights caught the glint of its too smooth skin, stretched taut over a skeletal frame that didn't belong to anything born on Earth. I swung the axe with everything I had, the blade arcing toward its head. It moved faster than I expected, jerking to the side, and the axe bit into the doorframe instead. Before I could wrench it free, the thing lunged. Its claws raked across my arm, searing pain erupting as blood soaked through my shirt. I stumbled back, my grip slipping on the axe handle. The creature didn't relent. It skittered forward, moving like a horrifying combination of a man and an insect. I grabbed the nearest thing within reach, a heavy metal flashlight, and swung blindly. The flashlight connected with a sickening crunch, and the creature let out a shriek that rattled my teeth. It recoiled, its head twitching violently as dark fluid oozed from the dent I'd left in its face. It wasn't blood, not exactly. The black liquid shimmered like oil, catching the dim light and rippling unnaturally as it dripped to the floor. For a moment, the thing seemed dazed, its movements jerky and uncoordinated. I didn't waste the opportunity. I grabbed the axe again, yanked it free, and bolted out of the office. The mall was a labyrinth in the dark. My boots echoed as I sprinted through the empty halls, past dead storefronts with shattered windows and mannequins frozen in eerie poses. Behind me, the scrape of claws on tile grew louder, closer. My arm throbbed with pain, each step jarring the wound and sending fresh waves of agony through my body. I needed to think, to find somewhere to hide. But the thing was too fast, and the open halls offered no cover. I rounded a corner, skidding to a halt as I spotted an old maintenance door ahead. The metal was rusted, the authorized personnel only sign faded and barely legible, but it was my only chance. I wrenched it open, slipping inside and slamming it shut just as the creature rounded the corner behind me. The door shuddered as it slammed into it from the other side, the metal groaning under the force. I shoved a heavy shelving unit against the door, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The pounding didn't stop. Each impact sent a jolt through the door, but it held. For now. I turned, my eyes adjusting to the dim light of the room. It was small and cluttered, filled with broken equipment and boxes of outdated mall supplies. In the corner, a set of stairs led down into deeper darkness. A sign above them read "Sub-basement access." The pounding stopped. For a moment, the silence was worse. My breath came in shallow gasps as I strained to hear anything beyond the blood rushing in my ears. Then, a new sound. A faint scrape, but not from the door. From above. I realized too late that the walls weren't my only concern. A vent cover near the ceiling rattled, and my stomach dropped. The creature wasn't trying to break through the door anymore. It was finding another way in. I grabbed the axe, my hands trembling as I backed toward the stairs. The vent cover burst open, and the thing spilled out, limbs twisting unnaturally as it hit the ground in front of me. Its black eyes gleamed, and for a moment, it just stared at me. Then it opened its mouth, or what passed for a mouth. A deep, resonant hum escaped, vibrating the air around us. I turned and ran. The sub-basement was worse than I imagined. The stairs led to a cavernous space beneath the mall, a sprawling network of maintenance tunnels and storage rooms lit by flickering, ancient bulbs. The air was thick and stale, the walls damp with something I didn't want to think about. I couldn't hear the creature behind me, but I knew it was there. My legs burned as I pushed deeper into the maze of tunnels, each turn more disorienting than the last. Finally, I found a small room with a heavy metal door and slipped inside, locking it behind me. The room was filled with old electrical panels and a single desk piled high with papers. I leaned against the wall, my chest heaving as I tried to steady my breathing. The silence pressed in, heavy and suffocating. Then the lights flickered again and went out. In the pitch black, I heard it. The scrape. It was in the room with me. I wasn't alone anymore. I gripped the axe so tightly my knuckles burned, the cold steel biting into my palms. My breath came in shallow, uneven gasps as I strained to listen. The scrape sounded again, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the door. It was closer, much closer. I swung blindly, the axe slicing through empty air. The sound stopped, replaced by the silence of something waiting, watching. My mind raced, screaming at me to move, but I couldn't see, couldn't think. Then a whisper, low, guttural, and impossibly close. Run. I didn't hesitate this time. I stumbled forward, hands outstretched until they slammed into the cold metal of the door. I fumbled with the lock, my fingers slick with sweat or blood. I couldn't tell. Finally, the latch gave and I tore the door open, plunging back into the tunnels. The lights flickered back to life. The narrow corridor stretched out before me, bathed in sickly yellow light. But it wasn't empty anymore. The creature stood at the far end, its body hunched and grotesque, limbs twitching with unnatural spasms. Its head cocked to one side, those soulless black eyes locking onto mine. And then it moved, not running, not crawling. It glided, its body shifting like smoke, each step faster than the last. I ran, the tunnels blurring around me as I sprinted through the maze, the creature's inhuman screeches echoing in my ears. I turned a corner, nearly slipping on the slick floor, and spotted another door ahead. This one was marked generator room. I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and jamming a nearby wrench into the handle to hold it closed. The generator room was worse than the tunnels. Rows of old machines hummed with faint vibrations, their surfaces coated in decades of grime. The air reeked of oil and rust, and the flickering lights overhead cast long, wavering shadows that seemed to move on their own. I scanned the room, my eyes landing on a toolbox sitting open on a nearby workbench. Wrenches, screwdrivers, even a crowbar. Tools, weapons. I grabbed the crowbar and held it tightly in one hand, the axe in the other. If that thing got through the door, I'd be ready. The door rattled. The wrench I jammed into the handle bent with a screeching sound as the creature clawed at the metal. My heart pounded as I backed away, the machines around me humming louder, almost like they were alive. And then I saw it. A vent, large enough to crawl through, its cover already hanging loose. It was a terrible idea, but the creature would be inside any second. I dropped the axe, too bulky for the tight space, and climbed into the vent, dragging the crowbar with me. The vent was suffocating. The narrow metal walls closed in around me, every movement echoing like thunder. My breaths came in shallow gasps as I crawled forward, the crowbar scraping against the floor of the vent. Somewhere behind me, I heard the sound of metal tearing. It was following me. The creature's guttural growls and scraping claws echoed through the vent, growing louder with each second. I crawled faster, the metal biting into my knees and palms, until I reached an intersection. Left or right, I had no idea. I picked randomly, praying I'd find a way out. The vent shook violently, the thing slamming against the walls as it closed in. I glanced back and saw it. A pale, twisted hand reaching into the narrow space, claws scraping against the metal as it pulled itself forward. Panic surged through me. I swung the crowbar, the steel connecting with a sickening crunch. The creature screeched, its hand retreating briefly before coming back, faster and angrier. The vent ahead opened into a larger space, a drop. Without thinking, I slid forward, tumbling out and landing hard on a cold, concrete floor. I was in the heart of the sub-basement. The room was enormous, its walls lined with rusted machinery and crumbling pipes. A single light hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly and casting eerie, shifting shadows. The air was freezing, my breath fogging in front of me as I staggered to my feet. The vent behind me rattled. I backed away, gripping the crowbar tightly as the creature emerged, its body folding and contorting to fit through the narrow opening. It hit the floor with a wet thud, rising slowly to its full, grotesque height. This was it. Nowhere left to run. Charged. The thing moved with terrifying speed, its limbs a blur as it lunged. I swung the crowbar with all my strength, the steel slamming into its head. It shrieked, black fluid spraying across the floor, but it didn't stop. It lashed out, claws raking across my chest and sending me sprawling. Pain exploded through me, but I held onto the crowbar, rolling to my feet just as it lunged again. This time I was ready. I ducked, the creature slamming into a rusted pipe behind me with a deafening crash. Steam hissed from the broken pipe, scalding the thing's flesh. It writhed, screeching in pain as I stumbled back, my mind racing. The machinery, the pipes, the generator. There had to be something I could use. My eyes landed on a control panel near the far wall. Wires, switches, and a massive lever marked emergency power dump. I ran. The creature followed, its screeches deafening as it clawed after me. I reached the panel, grabbed the lever, and pulled. The lights exploded. Every bulb in the room burst in a blinding flash, the air crackling with electricity. The creature let out a final, agonized scream as the power surged through the machinery, arcs of lightning tearing through its body. And then silence. When I opened my eyes, the thing was gone. Nothing remained but a blackened, smoldering stain on the concrete floor. I stumbled out of the sub-basement hours later, battered, bleeding, but alive. I quit the job the next day. You'd think surviving a nightmare like that would be the end of it. Walk away, start fresh, maybe drink yourself stupid to forget. But some things don't stay buried. Some things don't let you leave. Started small, just like before. 2 days after I quit, I was at home, nursing the deep gashes on my chest and arm with bandages and whiskey. I'd locked every door and window, shoved furniture against the entrances, and left every light in my apartment blazing. Sleep wasn't an option, not after what I'd seen. The silence of my apartment wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, too still, too quiet. Then I noticed my phone buzzing. The screen lit up with a call from a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I'd ignore it, but something about this felt different. I stared at the screen until it stopped. No voicemail. Moments later, the buzzing started again. Same number. My hand trembled as I picked it up. Hello. Silence. Then, a soft, familiar scrape. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The scrape was faint, distant, like it was coming from the other end of a long, dark tunnel. I hung up, my heart hammering in my chest. I told myself it was a prank, a bad joke or a coincidence. It had to be. But then it came again. This time, not from the phone. From the ceiling. The apartment wasn't safe anymore. I backed away from the phone, my eyes darting to the plaster ceiling above me. The scrape came again, louder now, dragging directly overhead. Something was in the crawl space. I grabbed the crowbar from beside the couch, my one keepsake from the nightmare, and moved toward the front door. I had to leave. I didn't know where I'd go, but staying wasn't an option. The scrape turned into a thud. My heart nearly stopped as the ceiling bowed inward, bits of plaster crumbling to the floor. The light fixture above me swayed violently, casting erratic shadows across the room. Whatever was up there, it was trying to get in. I ran. The streets weren't any safer. The city was unervingly quiet for midnight. No cars, no footsteps, just the hum of streetlights and the distant howl of wind. I kept glancing over my shoulder, my paranoia growing with every step. The creature was gone, destroyed, obliterated in a surge of electricity. I'd watched it die, but my instincts told me otherwise. I ducked into an all-night diner, its fluorescent sign buzzing faintly. The place was nearly empty, save for a lone cook behind the counter and a tired waitress scribbling in a notepad. I slid into a booth in the corner, my back to the wall, my crowbar resting against the seat beside me. Coffee? The waitress asked, her voice flat. Yeah, I said, not meeting her eyes. She poured the coffee and left without another word. I stared into the black liquid, trying to convince myself it was over. I was just traumatized, on edge. That's all. Then I noticed something in the reflection of the coffee. Behind me, in the window, a pale face with black, soulless eyes. Watching. It was back. I spun around, the crowbar in hand, ready to swing. The window was empty, just the dark street beyond. "Everything okay?" the waitress asked, frowning. "Did you see that?" My voice was barely above a whisper. "See what?" I didn't answer. I threw a wad of cash onto the table and bolted out the door, the crowbar gripped tightly in my hand. The streetlights flickered as I ran, casting long, shifting shadows across the pavement. And then I heard it again, that scrape. But this time it wasn't alone. There were more of them. As I turned a corner, I saw them. Figures crawling out from alleyways, dropping from rooftops, emerging from the shadows. Each one was grotesque, twisted in ways that defied nature. Their limbs were too long, their movements too fast. They weren't chasing me, not yet. They were watching, their black eyes following my every move. I backed away slowly, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind raced for an explanation, for some kind of plan. I needed to find somewhere to hide, somewhere they couldn't follow. But then they moved, all at once, like a wave of darkness crashing toward me. The subway was my only escape. I sprinted down the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the empty station. The air was thick and stale, the kind of smell that clings to abandoned places. The ticket booth was dark, the turnstiles broken, but I didn't care. I vaulted over them, my heart pounding in my ears. The platform was empty, the tracks stretching into darkness. I could hear them above, their claws scraping against the concrete as they followed. I didn't have much time. Then, a sound I didn't expect, a train. The headlights pierced the darkness of the tunnel, the rumble growing louder as the train barreled toward the station. I waved frantically, screaming for the conductor to stop. The train screeched to a halt, the doors sliding open. I jumped inside, collapsing onto the nearest seat as the doors closed behind me. But I wasn't alone. The train was full of them. The passengers weren't human. Not anymore. They sat perfectly still, their heads turning in unison to face me. Those black eyes, empty and endless, bore into mine. The conductor's voice crackled over the intercom, low and guttural. End of the line. The train lurched forward, plunging into the darkness of the tunnel. The air on the train felt wrong. Thick, humid, and oppressive. It clung to my skin like a living thing. The lights inside the car flickered, casting long, distorted shadows over the passengers. None of them moved, their black eyes fixed on me, their faces unervingly blank. I clutched the crowbar, my knuckles white, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The train rattled through the tunnel, the sound of its wheels grinding against the tracks almost deafening. I needed to get off. I couldn't tell how far we traveled. There were no windows, just endless darkness outside. Finally, the intercom crackled again. Next stop, nowhere. The voice wasn't human. It was deep, guttural, like metal grinding against bone. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I wasn't sure what would happen when the train stopped, but I knew I couldn't stay on board. The passengers started to move. One by one, their heads turned back to face forward. Their bodies twitched, jerking unnaturally, as if trying to remember how to function. Slowly, they stood, their movements stiff and mechanical, like puppets on frayed strings. And then they began walking toward me. The first one, a man in a rumpled suit, took a step, his neck twisting at an impossible angle. His mouth opened wide, but no sound came out. Behind him, the others followed, their movements synchronizing as they closed the distance between us. I backed away, swinging the crowbar in front of me. Stay back. My voice echoed in the small space, but they didn't stop. The train jolted, throwing me against a seat. My head slammed against the metal pole, and stars danced in my vision. The passengers didn't react. They just kept coming, their black eyes locked onto me. The doors slid open. I didn't wait to see where we were. I bolted, my boots hitting solid ground as I stumbled out of the train and into the unknown. The air was colder here, damp and heavy with the scent of rot. The platform was empty, lit by a single flickering bulb that cast eerie shadows over the cracked tiles. Behind me, the train doors hissed shut. I turned, expecting it to pull away, but it didn't. The passengers stood inside, pressed against the glass, their faces distorted in the dim light. Then the train began to move, slowly at first, its wheels screeching as it disappeared into the darkness of the tunnel. The last thing I saw was their eyes, still watching me as the train vanished. I was alone, or so I thought. The platform wasn't as empty as it seemed. At the far end, where the light didn't reach, something stirred. A faint, shuffling sound echoed through the space, followed by a low, guttural growl. My grip tightened on the crowbar as I inched forward, the sound growing louder with every step. Then I saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, hunched and grotesque. Its limbs were too long, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. But this one was different. His face wasn't blank like the others. It had features, a twisted, malevolent grin that split its face from ear to ear, revealing rows of jagged, yellow teeth. It wasn't watching me. It was waiting. It lunged. I swung the crowbar, the steel colliding with its arm with a sickening crunch. The creature screeched, the sound reverberating through the platform and rattling in my skull. It staggered back, but only for a moment. Then it came at me again. Its movements were faster now, almost a blur as it closed the distance between us. I swung wildly, the crowbar slicing through the air, but it dodged every blow. Its claws raked across my side, tearing through fabric and flesh. Pain flared, white-hot and searing, but I couldn't stop. I swung again, this time connecting with its head. The creature howled, black fluid spraying from the wound. It fell to the ground, writhing and twitching as the light above flickered wildly. I didn't wait to see if it would get back up. I ran. The tunnel stretched on forever. I didn't know where I was going. There were no signs, no landmarks, just endless darkness. The faint hum of electricity buzzed overhead, the lights growing dimmer the farther I went. My side throbbed, blood soaking through my shirt and dripping onto the cold, damp floor. Behind me, the growls started again. More of them. I pushed forward, my legs burning, my vision blurring from the pain and exhaustion. Finally, I saw something ahead, a door, rusted and barely hanging on its hinges, but a door nonetheless. I threw myself against it, the metal groaning as it swung open. I stumbled into a room I wasn't supposed to see. It was massive, the walls lined with rows of glowing screens. Each one displayed a different scene. People in their homes, walking down streets, sitting in cars. They didn't know they were being watched. In the center of the room was a massive machine, its wires snaking across the floor like veins. It pulsed with a faint, rhythmic glow, and the air around it buzzed with energy. And then I saw them, the creatures, dozens of them, suspended in glass cylinders, their bodies twitching and writhing as wires burrowed into their skin. They weren't being held captive. They were being created. This wasn't a nightmare. This was a production line. And I was next. The door behind me slammed shut. The growls grew louder, closer. My grip on the crowbar tightened as I turned to face the oncoming horde. I wasn't getting out of this room alive. But maybe, just maybe, I could stop it. I looked at the machine, at the wires, at the pulsing energy that filled the room. And I made my choice. Its pulse was hypnotic, like a giant heartbeat reverberating through the cavernous room. The glow from its core painted the walls with a sickly, shifting light, and the wires sprawled across the floor like a nest of serpents. I didn't know what it was or how it worked, but I knew one thing for certain. It was the source of all this. The creatures, the horrors, they were born here, and if I destroyed it, maybe this nightmare would finally end. The growls were deafening now. The door behind me buckled, the metal groaning as the creatures slammed against it. I didn't have much time. I ran to the nearest console, scanning the mess of buttons, switches, and glowing screens. None of it made sense, but the wires snaking out from the machine's base gave me an idea. If I couldn't shut it down, I could overload it. I dropped the crowbar and grabbed the nearest cable, yanking it free. Sparks exploded, the machine letting out a deafening roar like an injured animal. I grabbed another wire, then another, each one sending more sparks flying as the machine's glow flickered and dimmed. The pounding at the door grew louder. I could hear their claws now, tearing through the metal. "Come on," I muttered through gritted teeth, ripping another cable loose. The machine shuddered, its glow pulsing erratically. A high-pitched whine filled the room, growing louder with every passing second. Then the door gave way. They poured in like a flood. The creatures spilled into the room, their twisted bodies moving with horrifying speed. Dozens of them, their black eyes glinting in the dim light, their claws clicking against the floor as they surrounded me. I grabbed the crowbar, swinging wildly as the first one lunged. The steel connected with its skull, black fluid spraying across my face. But there were too many. Another one grabbed my arm, its claws digging into my flesh as it pulled me down. I kicked out, the crowbar slipping from my grip as more of them piled on top of me. The machine's whine reached a fever pitch, the glow from its core now blindingly bright. I could feel the heat radiating from it, the air around me crackling with energy. This was my only chance. With every ounce of strength I had left, I reached for the crowbar, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. I grabbed it and swung upward, slamming the crowbar into the machine's core. The explosion was instant. The room erupted in a blinding flash of light, the force of the blast throwing me backward. The creatures screeched, their bodies writhing as the energy surged through them. I hit the ground hard, my vision swimming as the heat and light consumed everything around me. For a moment, there was nothing, just blinding white and a deafening silence. Then the world came rushing back. When I opened my eyes, the room was unrecognizable. The machine was gone, reduced to a smoldering crater in the center of the room. The walls were scorched black, the screens shattered, their glow extinguished. The creatures lay scattered across the floor, their bodies lifeless and still. I staggered to my feet, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, the metallic taste of blood on my tongue. The room was silent now, save for the faint crackle of dying sparks. It was over, or so I thought. As I stumbled toward the exit, I heard it, a faint, familiar sound. The scrape. My blood ran cold as I turned, my eyes scanning the wreckage. One of the creatures was still moving. It dragged itself across the floor, its body broken and charred but still alive. Its black eyes locked onto mine, and a low, guttural growl escaped its throat. "No," I whispered, gripping the crowbar tightly. "Not again." Before I could move, the creature collapsed, its body twitching once before going still. I stood there, staring at it, my chest tightening with fear and exhaustion. Then I turned and walked away, leaving the horrors behind. The surface felt like a different world. When I finally emerged from the tunnels, the cool night air hit me like a wave. The city was quiet, its streets empty and still. I limped down the sidewalk, the crowbar dragging behind me, the distant hum of streetlights the only sound. I didn't know where I was going or what came next. All I knew was that I had survived, somehow. But even as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't really over, that something had followed me, that the darkness I'd escaped was still out there, waiting. And the scrape, it would come again. For days, I tried to go back to some semblance of normal. I avoided the news, didn't answer my phone, and barely left my apartment. I told myself that the machine was destroyed, that the creatures were gone, and that I could finally move on. But deep down, I knew better. The scrape haunted me. Not in sound, I hadn't heard it since that night, but in memory. It echoed in my mind whenever the world fell silent. Sometimes I'd wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I heard it in my dreams. And then 3 nights later, it came back. It started with a power outage. I was sitting in my living room, flipping through channels to drown out the quiet, when the lights flickered. For a moment, everything went dark. The TV, the lamps, even the streetlights outside. I froze, my heart racing as the darkness pressed in around me. Then the power returned, but something was different. The TV wasn't playing my show anymore. The screen was filled with static, faint and crackling, but there was something else. A shadowy figure moved within the static, its shape distorted and flickering. I stared, unblinking, as the figure leaned closer, its face coming into focus. Black eyes stared back at me, and then it smiled. The scrape returned. It started faint, like it was coming from the other side of the building. Then it grew louder, closer, moving through the walls like a thing alive. I backed away from the TV, grabbing the crowbar I hadn't let out of my sight since that night. "Not again," I whispered, my voice shaking. "You're gone. I destroyed you." The scrape didn't care. It grew louder, reverberating through the walls, the ceiling, the floor. I swung my head toward the window, expecting to see something outside, but the street was empty. Then the sound stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. I gripped the crowbar tighter, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I turned slowly, scanning the room, and there it was. It was in my apartment. The creature stood in the corner, half hidden in shadow. Its body was charred and broken, its limbs twitching with unnatural spasms. Black fluid oozed from its wounds, staining the carpet beneath it. But its eyes, those black, soulless eyes, were as sharp as ever. It stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. My stomach churned as I realized it wasn't alone. From the hallway, another figure emerged. Then another. Twisted and grotesque, their bodies moved like marionettes, jerking and spasming as they filled the room. I swung the crowbar, my voice rising in a panicked shout. "Stay back! Stay away from me!" They didn't stop. I fought like hell. The first creature lunged, its claws raking through the air. I swung the crowbar with all my strength, the steel connecting with a sickening crunch. It fell back, writhing on the floor, but the others kept coming. I swung again and again, the crowbar growing slick with the black, tar-like fluid that spilled from their bodies. One of them grabbed my arm, its claws digging into my flesh. I screamed, twisting free and slamming the crowbar into its face. For every one I knocked down, another took its place. The apartment was filled with them now, their black eyes glowing in the dim light. I couldn't keep up. I was losing, and then they stopped. The creatures froze, their bodies jerking unnaturally as if caught in invisible strings. They turned in unison, their heads snapping toward the door. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the scrape started again, louder than ever, shaking the walls with its intensity. The door exploded inward. It wasn't just them anymore. A new figure stepped inside, towering over the others. Its body was massive, its limbs twisted into grotesque shapes that scraped against the ceiling. Its face was a blank slate, smooth and featureless, but its presence was suffocating. The smaller creatures parted for it, their movements synchronized like a hive. The thing turned its blank face toward me, and though it had no eyes, I felt its gaze pierce through me. I stumbled back, my legs giving out as I hit the floor. The crowbar slipped from my hand, clattering uselessly against the wood. This wasn't something I could fight. It reached for me. One of its massive hands stretched out, its fingers impossibly long and sharp. I tried to move, to scramble away, but my body wouldn't obey. My chest tightened, my breath coming in ragged gasps as its hand drew closer. Then something inside me snapped. I grabbed the crowbar and swung upward with everything I had. The steel connected with the creature's hand, sending a shockwave through my arms. It didn't flinch. Instead, it tilted its head, almost as if amused. Then it spoke. "You cannot escape." And then it was gone. The creatures, the massive figure, the suffocating presence. All of it disappeared, as if it had never been there. The apartment was silent, save for the sound of my own ragged breathing. I sat there for what felt like hours, the crowbar clutched tightly in my trembling hands. The scrape didn't come back. The shadows stayed still, but the words echoed in my mind. "You cannot escape." I knew now that this wasn't over. It was never over. The machine may have been destroyed, but whatever it unleashed wasn't bound to it. It was out there, growing, spreading. And it was coming for me. I couldn't live like this anymore. The apartment felt like a tomb, every corner hiding shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. The scrape haunted me, not just in memory but in anticipation. I knew it would come again. I had to end this, for good. Whatever I destroyed in that sub-basement was just a piece of something larger, a fragment of something ancient and insidious. And if it was still alive, still growing, I needed to find it and finish what I started. The search began where it all ended. Whitestone Mall was condemned a week after my shift, cordoned off with rusted chains and bright yellow tape. Officially, it was deemed unsafe due to structural collapse. Unofficially, no one talked about it. I broke in through the east wing, the same corridor where I'd first heard the scrape. The air was damp and heavy, every step echoing through the emptiness. The smell of mildew mixed with something fouler, a metallic tang that made my stomach churn. The way down to the sub-basement was buried under rubble, but I found a service hatch behind the old generator room. It led to a tunnel even deeper than the one I'd escaped from, a place I didn't know existed. And there, beneath the crumbling mall, I found it, the heart of the machine. The room was massive, far larger than the one I'd destroyed. Banks of glowing monitors lined the walls, displaying countless feeds from cameras I didn't recognize. Homes, streets, abandoned buildings, all being watched. In the center stood a monolithic machine, towering and grotesque. Its surface pulsated like it was alive, wires snaking out from its base and into the walls. The air buzzed with energy, and the light it emitted was sickly, almost organic. I wasn't alone. The creatures were everywhere, clinging to the walls, crouched in corners, their black eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. They didn't attack. They just watched, their heads tilting in eerie unison as I approached the machine. And then I saw it. The master. It emerged from the machine itself, its massive form coalescing from the pulsing light. Taller than the one in my apartment, its body seemed to shift and ripple, like it was made of liquid shadow. Its face was a smooth, featureless void, and yet I felt its gaze pierce me. "You shouldn't have come," it said, its voice a low rumble that vibrated through the air. I tightened my grip on the crowbar, my heart pounding. "You won't win." The thing tilted its head. "Win? You don't understand. You're already part of us. Every step you've taken, every swing of that weapon, it's brought you closer to becoming one of my own." I refused to listen. Whatever it was, whatever it wanted, I couldn't let it escape this place. The fight was chaos. The creatures swarmed, their bodies moving as one, a tide of black and twisted limbs. I swung the crowbar, the steel connecting with bone and flesh, black fluid spraying as I fought my way to the machine. The master loomed above me, its voice echoing in my head. "You can't stop this. You are nothing." But I wasn't nothing. Not anymore. I reached the base of the machine, where the wires converged into a massive, pulsating core. Sparks danced across its surface, the energy almost overwhelming. I raised the crowbar, ready to strike, when the master's hand slammed into me, throwing me across the room. Pain exploded in my chest as I hit the wall, but I didn't let go of the crowbar. I struggled to my feet, my vision swimming, as the master closed in. I made my choice. The machine was too well protected. I couldn't destroy it from the outside. But there was another way. I charged at the master, dodging its outstretched claws, and leapt straight into the heart of the machine. The world dissolved into blinding light and searing pain as I plunged the crowbar into its core, black fluid and sparks erupting around me. The machine screamed, an unearthly, deafening wail that shook the ground. The creatures convulsed, their bodies disintegrating into ash as the light consumed them. The master roared, its body unraveling, its voice a thunderous echo. "You will never escape me." And then, everything went dark. When I woke, it was over. I was lying on the cold ground, the machine nothing more than a smoking ruin. The creatures were gone, their presence erased as if they had never existed. The air was still, the silence deafening. I staggered to my feet, the crowbar clattering to the ground. My body ached, my skin burned, But I was alive. The room around me was collapsing, the walls crumbling as the last remnants of the machine's energy faded away. I climbed out of the tunnels, the morning sun blinding as I emerged into the open air. The mall was silent, abandoned, but the weight that had pressed on me since that first night was finally gone. The scrape never came again. I don't know what I destroyed that night, or if it was truly gone. Maybe it's still out there, waiting, watching. But for now, I'm free. For now, I'm alive. And that's enough. Did you like these stories? Write in the comments. And please write what you didn't like. It will be useful for me to know your opinion. And I will improve my work. Thank you. Subscribe to my channel and click the bell so as not to miss new stories. I try for you.